Hello, my name is Nathan Buttry, and on behalf of the Humanities Tennessee, I'd like to welcome you to the Southern Festival of Books here in Nashville, Tennessee. Whether you're watching us online or joining us later on C-SPAN, we got a great session for you today, and we're glad you're with us. Before we start, I'd like to thank a few of the festival's key sponsors for their ongoing support. The Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Ingram Content Group, the Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, Parnassus Books. We are grateful for your continued support. Thank you for everything you do to help us make this a great festival every year. If you'd like to purchase books that you see featured here at the festival, we encourage you to do that through the Parnassus book link in the Facebook Live or YouTube chat section. Sales through Parnassus Books support the festival and help to keep it free. So we have a special guest today. Our author is the former two-term mayor of Knoxville and former two-term governor of Tennessee. During his tenure, Tennessee became the fastest improving state in the country in K-12 education and the first state to provide free community college or technical school for all its citizens, in addition to adding 475,000 net new jobs. Haslam serves on the board of directors for Teach for America, the Wilson Center, and Young Life. He and his wife of over 40 years, Chrissy, have 3 children and 10 grandchildren. He's here today to discuss his new book, Faithful Presence, The Promise and Peril of Faith in the Public Square. He's also my former boss and a special guest today, Governor Bill Haslam. Welcome to the Southern Festival of Books.
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for including me. I'm still a little unused to having people introduce me as an author. When you say our author today, I'm thinking, oh, fun. I wonder who's going to join us. I'm kind of used to being on the other side of the table, but it's really fun to be a part of this. Thanks.
You're welcome. Well, that's what's cool about the festival is it's kind of like the U.S. Open, you know. If you can qualify, you know, just one book gets you qualified, so that's all you need. Yeah.
That's probably a good thing in my case.
Well, one of the things about this session that we need to talk about is time. So we got about 40 minutes here to talk. So I thought we could just jump right in. And I've read your book, and I've read through it a couple of times. And, you know, I just have some general questions that I thought would be interesting, maybe for our viewers and for me in general. So just to start us off here, tell me what inspired you to write the book and why you chose this topic and this time to do it.
You know, like almost everybody else in America, I'm frustrated by what I see happening in our political arena and not just the polarization and the partisanship, because I might argue that's not all that new, but with the hatred, and that's not too strong of a word, that exists today, the feelings that each side has toward the other. And one of the things I talk about in the book is there's something called motivation, attribution, asymmetry, which is how much not just you disagree with the other side, but you think the other side is doing what they're doing or believes what they do for bad motives. And the motivation, attribution, asymmetry, this is 4 years ago in the country, was greater between Republicans and Democrats than that between Israelis and Palestinians. And this kind of just animosity toward the other side in this sense of the goal in an argument or a discussion is to win, not to get to the right answer, just, I think, concerns all of us. And I wrote the book more pointedly toward people of faith, because rather than being the salt and light that, particularly for Christians, that Jesus asks us to be, I feel like people of faith are acting just like everybody else in the public square. So this was my attempt to say, what's the problem and what might it look like to be different?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So from, you know, based on your experience as governor or as mayor or just in life, as far as the political service is concerned, you know, can you share some examples of where, you know, you were kind of called into a situation where you had to have a faithful presence and what that looked like and maybe what the alternative was if you had chosen not to be the type of faithful presence that you're referring to in the book?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess part of my argument would be having a faithful presence means not just in those big decisions that get a lot of attention, but in what we do every day. And by the way, while I'd argue my argument is about here's what a faithful presence might look like in the public square. I would argue you have that same thing if you're a teacher or a hospital administrator or work on an assembly line or whatever it is you do, that there's a way to think about, okay, who are we called to do and be? And I think I'm going to come back and answer your question in a second, I promise. But I think part of the problem is, particularly in politics, we think so much about, okay, I'm a Christian, so what's the Christian position on this issue? Well, on some things, it's really clear, biblically. I mean, we're supposed to be concerned for the poor. We're supposed to feed the poor. It doesn't tell us how to do that. And so I think that one of the points I'm making in the book is, let's be those things that we know, hey, this is really clear. There's like concern for the poor, feeding the poor. That's not up for debate. Mm-hmm. How we do that in terms of what economic system is best suited to do that, I think is up for debate. And that's where we should engage fully to get to the best answer. Back to your question, our circumstances, I think one of the things where I, was called to have a faithful presence, I think that what I'd classify as this: part of having a faithful presence is having the humility to know that you might not be right. My first ever political boss was when I was an intern in college and worked for Senator Howard Baker, who's United States Senator from Tennessee, became Majority Leader of the Senate, went to be Ronald Reagan's Chief of Staff, was our ambassador to Japan under George H.W. Bush. And Baker had a saying that said, always remember the other fella might be right. He was from a little kind of country town north of Knoxville. And that was his way of saying, in every discussion I'm in, I'm going to work my hardest to remember that while I have my view of the right answer here, I need to walk into it with the realization that I might not have this exactly right. And so what happened a lot as governor is one of the problems, particularly within our own team, within our own staff, is once the governor speaks, everybody says, okay, well, that's where we are. That's going to be the administration's position. But I learned real quickly that didn't get us to the best answer. So an example of realizing I might not always be right was moving my chair from the head of the table when we had our senior staff meetings to the middle of the table, so that I could make certain that my voice didn't cut off the discussion, because I learned real quickly if our answer was the answer I walked in the door with, it mm-hmm. wasn't going to be as good as the answer that all of us could walk out of the door with.
That's true. Talking about anxiety, you've got a couple of sections in your book here, some on anxiety, some on humility. We know that anxiety and pride have a negative impact on us in our personal lives and how we act politically or can act politically. But in a competitive political climate, what's some ways that we can win if you're trying to get your idea out there and compete and put forth a good argument? How's the best way to do that with humility and with meekness? I know you mentioned those two things in the book.
Yeah, and so let me start with meek does not mean weak. Okay, mm-hmm. Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek; they'll inherit the earth." But he also later, Paul tells Timothy, we haven't been given a spirit of timidity. So we know that meek doesn't mean weak. What it does mean is a little what I was talking about before with humility, is a sense of I know I don't get things right all the time. I mean, this today, and if I had a little wrong-o-meter that followed me around, it would be at 2,763, and it's a day off where I've been, pretty much doing not much. So if I know that's true in my personal life, I know that can be true in everything else I do. So I think that the thing is, that doesn't mean we're supposed to just surrender the argument and say, well, whatever you think is right. No, we're supposed to be about truth, and we want to work hard to get to the truth, and we're supposed to be about serving people. So in government, we want to work hard to get to the answer that will serve the most people. We just have to go about it without a sense of, if somebody is on the other side of me, they're not the bad guy. Okay, the person on the other side is not the bad guy. The bad guy is the problem we're trying to solve. The bad guy is too many people that don't have an education that's going to prepare them for the rest of their life. Too many people that don't have a job that can help feed their family. Those are the issues. The folks that have a different approach to it, that as long as we think they're the bad guys, we're not going to have a discussion that's going to actually lead us to a better place. And by the way, that's true of both sides. A lot of people hear that say, finally, yeah, now hopefully those Republicans will see that the Democrats aren't all bad guys, or vice versa. My sense is, like I said, back to what I talked about with motivation, attribution, and symmetry, is that's where we are as a country, both sides thinking the other folks are bad guys.
Well, that's what was interesting about the book. When I read it, it's not about political theory. It's not about one side or the other. It's about posture, or at least it read that way to me. It's like, what posture are you in when you engage in political life, and when you engage in the public square, and why is it that all of a sudden our gloves come off and our manners go away when we enter politics, as opposed to when we're at a store buying something, or on the playground or anywhere?
It's such a great question. So your question, why do we seem to say we're going to put the rules for how we act on hold in the political arena? That's kind of the question. Why do we say that? Well, I think there's two reasons. One, and again, I'm speaking to people who, I'm primarily writing to people who have the view of the world that I do, in terms of approaching it as a Christian. You can go to retreats and Sunday school classes and sessions galore about here's what a Christian marriage looks like, or here's what it looks like to raise your children in a Christian home, or even if you're a business person, here's what it looks like to be a business person in today's market. In today's market, what we don't have much is here's what it looks like to act like a Christian in the public square. You don't hear a lot of sermons about that. Maybe one or two occasionally. Mm-hmm. You certainly don't. We don't have a lot of conferences and retreats about that. We have retreats or conferences about how do we win on this issue. And so we haven't developed, this is a word that sounds so boring to most people, but we haven't developed a theology of politics. We haven't developed this theology of politics, kind of our view of how God sees this arena. How should we act? And I think that's the first reason. We haven't really developed a theology of our politics. The second is this, and believe me, I've heard this, and I'm betting not betting. I know when you worked in our office, you heard a lot of this, of folks who called up just really, really mad. And Nathan was famous for being able to have civilized conversations with people who did not want to have a civilized conversation. But, people who were just so mad. And their point was this: the stakes are too high. We can't act we can't go act by Sunday school rules because the stakes are so high and the other side is not going to unilaterally disarm. And so if we all of a sudden start playing in a way that is humble and actually forgives the other side when they do us wrong, then we're going to get wiped off the field. The point I would bring up again to people of faith is this: we don't waive the rules for circumstances in other areas of life. We don't say in business, you need to act ethically as a Christian believer, unless your company is getting ready to go out of business. And then in that case, then do whatever you need. Mm-hmm. We don't say in marriage, you promise to be faithful to your wife as long as you both shall live. But we'll suspend all that stuff if the person in the office next to you is really hot. We don't give ourselves those sort of buys or passes, if you will, in other areas, but we have in politics. And we justify it by saying there's so much at stake. This matters so much that we have to play to win.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned in your book, used your students as an example of how they are often willing to see the ills of an institution or an organization, but when it comes to personalizing it, it's not quite as easy.
Yeah, so that I think that's interesting. I mean, we talk particularly today about the issues around systemic racism or systemic social injustice of some type, and that is real. In my opinion, we have places where injustice has become part of the system or part of an institution. But I think it's a lot harder for all of us to drill down and see our part in that. That system started with somebody like us um, making that first step in a way that wasn't just, and it didn't show any kind of mercy, and that became perpetuated. And so, if that's true in these systems that have been built up, it's true in the things we do in our lives as well. And like I said, I'm struck particularly by the generation today that's in their 20s are very quick to protest and march and talk about injustice out there, a lot less willing to see injustice in here.
Mm-hmm. In chapter 2, you talk about, I think it's chapter 2, compromise. And you say compromise now means lack of conviction, and it has become a dirty word. And we have a question here from a viewer that I want to share that's kind of under that heading. The question is, how do you draw a line between humility and tradition? In an age where most leaders, especially in the South, feel outdated a bit. Sometimes folks say that they're archaic in their conventions. Do you think there's room for open-mindedness?
Well, I think the point I'm trying to get one of the points I'm trying to get across is this: if we really are going to solve the hard political issues of today, we have to start with the realization that the country is pretty evenly divided, right? I mean, the last 10 presidential elections or 9 have been decided by single digits, the longest streak in history. The Senate is literally 50-50. The House, there are 3 votes separating it. We're an evenly divided country, and yet we don't think we're evenly divided because everybody we're around thinks like we do. We tend to live in neighborhoods of people that think like we do. We go to churches of people that think like we do. We can choose our news, so I can choose MSNBC or CNN or Fox or One America or whoever I want to pick by where I'm on the spectrum. And we love kind of confirmation bias is a real thing. We love it when people tell us that what we think is true really is true. And so I like the news a lot more when it tells me, hey, here's why here's the truth behind that. And I go, that's what I think too. See, I'm right. Mm-hmm. So we're evenly divided, but we don't think we are because everybody around us thinks like we do. That's where the humility comes in, is to realize that everybody does not think just like I do. So there's a real need for me to understand the other side. There's some really great professors that teach you to learn by making you make the best argument for the other side of a case that you're in the middle of, mm-hmm. which I think is great training, mm-hmm. to mm-hmm. really understand what is it that is drawing people toward that point of view. So that's not, there are things I think the questioner asked about, particularly in a Southern culture, there's things that are more Southern tradition that's kind of, Southern hospitality, if you will, where we say, bless your heart to your face, but behind your back, we cut you up. That's maybe the Southern tradition that folks are talking about. I would argue that's not humility at all. Humility is recognizing that we're broken people. And so I'm going to give the broken person on the other side of the table a little bit of grace and the opportunity to hear their point of view.
There's a good book. It's often used in schools, Getting to Yes, and it talks about in negotiation, finding out what's motivating, getting to know the people you're working with and negotiating with, to find out what's motivating them, because that really may help the process along, as opposed to just what their position is. In the book, you refer to a bunch of different great theologians, religious thinkers, Martin Luther, William Wilberforce, C.S. Lewis. How does their political and social climate of discontent compare with ours? And then, how applicable are their words and their lessons for us today?
Yeah, so I think it's one of the reasons I love things like this festival that remind people of the value of great books is one of the things you learn in a book or in a lot of the great books is people living in a very different place and a very different time than we do struggled with many of the same things. And so you read about a William Wilberforce who was trying to abolish slavery in the United Kingdom. And he spends basically most of his adult life. He loses something like 20 times. His bill loses in Parliament. But through persistence and through a group of people who are working with him, he ultimately lives to see slavery abolished in the United Kingdom. And if you read the arguments back and forth at that time, right now we go, well, how did it take them so long to do away with something that was obviously so wrong? But we read the arguments back and forth, and we see the world hasn't really changed all that much. Or you think about a C.S. Lewis, who's writing, a lot of his writings were during World War II. And so we think, well, okay, Lewis, all that sounds great, but that's not the real world we live in. But you think, well, he's actually living in a world where the Nazis are bombing London where he lives, or, on a regular basis. So the ability to take truths that people have written in the past in very different times and apply them to our present situation is, I think, one of the important things that too many of us today don't take advantage of.
Well, I know you've been on a tour across the state, a bit of a tour, making stops, introducing people to the books, the content, and what you went through to write it and what inspired you. So I'm curious, what's the response been from people when you meet with them in person? Has anything surprised you about their response, and has anybody just outright disagreed with you?
That's a great question. So, and I didn't know what to expect out of all that, being a very first-time author. So, actually, the pleasant surprise has been it's led to lots of really good, thoughtful conversations with people. So, my experience has been a little bit like that of being in public office. People say, "Gosh, when you go out in public, do people come up and accost you all the time and tell you you're wrong and how bad you are?" The truth is that happens about 5% of the time. The rest of the time, when people come up to you in public, you have very helpful, thoughtful conversations or very encouraging conversations. In the book, because the book, like I said, a lot of them are just, "Hey, read the book, loved it," or "read the book, thanks for writing it," whatever. But it has caused a lot more, like I said, thoughtful conversations than I would expect from folks. Some of whom are old friends, people I went to college with, that I get an email out of the blue. "Hey, I saw you wrote this book. It's interesting. Can we talk about such and such?" Some just people I know, and some folks that you run into a restaurant who happen to have read the book. So that's actually been encouraging and fun to have those interchanges of people who are actually responding to something specific that you've written and how they feel about that. But overall, the experience, people ask me, "How's the book going?" One of the things that I didn't realize is you don't really know how your book's going. You hear from your publisher on a very infrequent basis about how many books you've sold or anything like that. So it's not like a business where every day, okay, here's what we sold and here are our expenses and here's how it's going. So people go, "How's the book going?" I go, "I really don't know, but I've had fun with it."
Well, that's good. That's good. The notes section of the book, it's essentially a bibliography. It's kind of all your sources and cited references. And, is this a look inside your personal library, or, how much of these references are things that you have been reading or have read, and how much research did you have to do for the book?
It's interesting. So I left office in January of 2019, and I started writing the book really about a year later. So in January of 20 or somewhere, maybe February, March. And so in the meantime, I kind of was thinking I might want to write this, and you'd come across something, or you read something, or you'd be reminded of something, and you'd go back and look at it again with the thought of kind of starting this mental file, if you will, about things that you wanted to put in the book. So a lot of those were books that I happened to have read recently enough that I could remember them to go look up the passage. And some of them were things that once you start on the topic, you actually kind of dive into a little further, or somebody tells you, "Oh, I just read something interesting. I know you're working on that book," and we'll refer another book to you. But I love reading. I'm one of these guys. I usually have 3 books going on at any one time, of all different types. And I hope I always stay that way.
Well, I remember that when you were governor, I think maybe it was a personal goal you had to read a certain amount of books. I can't remember what the number was, But I'm curious what the number was and if you made it, and are you still reading at that pace?
Well, I had more time now, so I read a little bit more. Yeah, I was trying to, while I was governor, to every year read 30 books. Just it's 2.5 a month, and I didn't want to make it to where my life was so full that I wasn't taking time to read and learn. And so some of those were books, like I said, that were about something I really wanted to study and read more about that was helpful as it pertained to the job. And some of them were just a great novel that could take your brain somewhere else at the end of the day when you had spent too much time wrestling through hard issues. And there are books that do what a lot of great books do, take you at another time and place and outside of your own daily wrestling.
So you're reading fiction and nonfiction?
I do. I love both. And the answer to your question, if I kept that up since I left office, I actually read a little more now because I have some more time than I did when I was in office. But I read, I love history. I love great fiction. And then I love books that are trying to explain something that I'm trying to figure out. So I usually have one of each going on, some book that's history related, something that's addressing some subject that I'm trying to wrestle through, and then just either a fun or a great novel.
Where do people recommend books to you? Do you have a book club? How does Governor Haslam find his books?
Well, one of the interesting things when you're in office, you wouldn't believe how many books you get. I literally had a closet full of books because some of them are people who want you to understand their argument or where they're coming from. They think, well, if the governor will just read this book, he'll see the world the way I do. And so you get a lot of those. And then you get a lot of authors who have written a book and think, well, couldn't hurt to have one of these in the governor's hands. Maybe he'll like it and read it and tell other people about it. And then so you get a lot of books that way. But I've always been one who I read, I read through book reviews. Chrissy and I have a subscription to something that comes out monthly that recommends books. I read book reviews in the newspaper. And then sometimes I still love wandering through bookstores. So I heard you all talking about, I think maybe Parnassus is one of the sponsors of this. When I'm in Nashville, I was there last week and spent some time just wandering through and picked up 3 books and do the same thing in Knoxville and other places.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of authors and readers and would-be authors and readers who attend the session. And I'm curious, what was your experience as a first-time author writing a book about something you're passionate about? What did you learn? What could you, and from that, what could you tell or share with, would-be writers or first-time writers?
First, write down your footnotes and your sources when you're putting them down. Don't think, oh, I'll go back and find that later. I'm sort of kidding about that, but there were so many things that I would write down a quote for and say, oh, I know where that is. It's in this magazine article or it's in this book. And I'd keep writing, finishing the chapter, which led to a lot of long nights when I was finished and trying to go back and find that article or that or where that quote was in the book. So I say that sort of as a joke. I think the main thing I would say is this: I have a new respect for real authors, as I call them, because it's a lot harder than I thought it would be to come up with a coherent argument throughout the book that kind of made the case, stated the issue, made the case. Here's what we do about it. To build that kind of arc of a story that good story writers have was harder to do than I thought. And I think the other thing was but the flip side is it was a great experience for me personally to sit down and say, this is something I feel strongly about, but the need to actually put in paper the argument that I wanted to make, to put that on paper was really, really helpful for me in terms of wrapping my arm around my own understanding of the situation.
There are some passages that I underlined and flagged when I was reading the book, and I'll give you a couple of examples of them that I thought just stand out. Real leadership, however, is about connecting the legitimate problems facing those voters with the difficult reality of governing and actually working to solve those problems. Another example of a sentence like that, a statement or almost a conclusion. this is later in the book, knowing that the church today can and should be people who are known for entering the public square effectively with humility rather than pride and arrogance. It is simply the only way. Scripture doesn't come with exceptions for certain situations like politics. I'm curious, did you have these thoughts? Were these kind of similar ideas that you wanted to make sure you built a framework around when you were writing the book? Or did you come through the book and then land on these things and they became sort of pillars of the idea that you were sharing?
Yeah, so a little bit about those. Your question's a great one. The first one of those, that leadership is about actually solving problems, was one of my main motivators for writing the book. I'm afraid in today's politics, we've gotten to where the folks who get the attention and that people think of as being, well, they're a strong mayor, governor, president, whatever, are those folks who make those statements that people most are willing to jump up and say, yeah, there's somebody who thinks who sees the problem the way I do. Mm-hmm. But most of the time, those statements they're making are doing nothing to solve the problem. They're stating the obvious about something, and they're stating it in a way that leaves other folks going, yeah, finally, way to go. You told it like it is. But telling it like it is not solving the problem. And one of the things I hope the book does is encourage people to think about who they're supporting in elections, and to not do it just by who's saying things that you think, boy, that sounds great, but who actually is solving problems. At the end of the day, this is important stuff that government is supposed to do. And these are hard issues. And I'm afraid we've let rhetoric overcome resume, in the sense of great talking points seem to mean a lot more than has that person actually ever solved a problem anything like the one that they're addressing now. So I think that was part of the thing I really wanted to make certain I talked about in the book. The other around the second idea you brought up was more one that I kind of coalesced around a lot. The more I wrote, the more I thought, yeah, this is exactly how I feel.
Another one in chapter 12, it speaks to a little bit about what you were saying about the difference between someone who makes a great punchline or says something that rallies people, but not necessarily about solving problems. In chapter 12, you write, "We cannot react out of hostility to those who differ from us politically when we are supposed to love our enemies. If we are going to have a faithful presence, that presence cannot be marked by fear of our changing circumstances and anger at the people who think differently than we do."
Right. So if you think about it, I think a lot of the worst tendencies of politics today are because we're reacting out of fear. And I know that as Christians, we're supposed to, we're told don't fear more than almost anything else in the Bible. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we know fear is a bad place to come from. Yet that's what's marking the discussion. The second thing is this idea that the person on the other side is that they're the bad guys. If the person on the other side is, as we, again, the Christian faith believe they are, if they're created in the image of God, I have to look at them in a whole different way than I do if I don't believe that. And again, as Christians, that's a fairly fundamental truth that all men are created in the image of God. If that's true, then that person who in my neighborhood who has the yard sign that I can't believe they're supporting that candidate, or the person that's sending out these tweets that drive me crazy, or even the nightly news show that I want to yell at the TV about because I can't believe they're saying that. I can't react in the same way if I actually think that person on the other side of the argument is created in the image of God. I have to react in a really different way. Now, I want to be really clear. This doesn't mean we're supposed just to be mushy, whatever goes. Again, we're supposed to be people of the truth. And we have, if we're called to government service, it should be about getting to answers that actually serve people well. And like I said, I have strong views about what does and doesn't do that. But I can't, if I'm saying I'm a Christian, I can't approach the argument as if the person on the other side, like I said, is not created in the image of God. It's interesting, if you read John Lewis about the civil rights movement, One of the interesting quotes that Lewis has is about how much of the civil rights movement is rooted, that the foundations are all about that idea that we're created in the image of God. And that's the argument that they made very successfully, I would argue, about why the racism that they were working to end was so wrong.
You mentioned in the book the sort of Netflix portrayal of politics and people involved in politics. What would you say to people of faith who feel like they have a contribution to make, but feel like the climate is one that isn't ready to listen to what they may have to share, or that it may not be useful or interesting or winnable, if you will?
Yeah, great. Or it's, I mean, the thing in addition to everything you just listed that I heard most frequently, it's just all too muddy. I don't want to do it. It's like
right.
The whole thing turns me off and kind of feel like a pox on both of their houses. I'm frustrated with both sides. Mm-hmm. It's one of the quotes that I have in the book that from Martin Luther that you mentioned earlier was Luther said, send your very best into the public arena. It said in preaching, the Holy Spirit does all the work, but the ambiguities of the public arena are such that we need our very best people to go to be a part of that. I think I'd say this: the verse that actually got me to first decide to run for mayor, which led to running for governor, is in the book of Jeremiah. And the people of Israel are being held captive in Israel. I'm sorry, in Babylon. And so it's Nebuchadnezzar, one of the worst guys of all time. Okay, really bad ruler. And Jeremiah is back in Jerusalem, and he writes to them. And now I always tell folks, if I'm being held captive somewhere, and I hope when you write me, you say, I'm coming to get you, Bill. Just keep your head down, stay out of trouble. But Jeremiah writes them, and he says something. This is Jeremiah 29. He basically says, get used to it. You're going to be there a while. And then he says, build homes and plant gardens, raise your children, have your children marry. And then he says in 29:7, he says, seek the welfare of the place where I have called you, for in its welfare you will find your peace. Okay. I mean, think about what he's saying. Like, what do you mean the welfare of the place we've been called? This is a horrible place. We're being kept as slaves by Nebuchadnezzar. He's a horrible, bad guy. What do you mean seek the welfare of this place? But that's what Jeremiah tells them to do. And I'm afraid too many of us have reacted by saying, this is a horrible, I mean, look at what our culture has degraded to. Look at the state of our country. I think the message back to us that God would give is the same one that Jeremiah sent to the people of Israel. We're supposed to seek the welfare of the place we've been called. Part of the way you do that is to make certain you have the very best government in place possible. One of the biggest things I learned being in office was how much difference it makes who we elect. Having the right person on school board, or the right person on county commission, or the state legislature, or in the governor's office, or president in the White House, all of that matters way more than I thought before I got in, and I thought it was important before then. If we really do care about the world that God has asked us to go to seek the welfare of, to seek the peace of, if you will, then one of the ways we can best serve that is in the whole public arena. And it's an area that if our response is to say, away with all of it, I'm going to go worry about eternal things, I think we're missing part of what our calling is.
There's another section here that I have marked that I think sums that up well with what you were just saying. It's at the very end of chapter 12. I think it is for a time like this that Christians are called to the public square, but not in the ways that we have traditionally approached it. These times call out for people who understand that our cries for justice have to be accompanied by a humble and merciful spirit. These times require citizens who are committed to both truth and love, not one or the other. We can be people who truly seek the peace of the places we have been exiled, knowing that God has tied our welfare to the welfare of the places he's called us.
Well, that's was obviously the argument I was just making.
Mm-hmm.
Here's one of the messages that when I speak to audiences that are purely that it's more of a religious situation, people that are purely coming at it from a faith angle, is Jesus always starts with us. He always starts with the religious people. And you think about when the woman is caught in adultery in that famous scene where this mob brings the woman who's been caught in adultery. Jesus eventually gets to her and says, "Go and sin no more." So he does deal with her, but first he deals with all the religious types, and he says, "Hey, whichever of you is without sin, cast the first stone." And then it says, beginning with the older ones, they drop their rocks and walk away. In Matthew, when Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount, arguably the most famous sermon ever, he talks about that Christians are supposed to be salt and light. And salt in those days was it was a preservative. It was to keep the meat from going bad. Today in the world, I think Christians are looking out saying, can you believe how horrible the culture has gotten? Can you believe where we are as a country? And I think Jesus's words would be, that's what the salt's supposed to be doing. If the meat's going bad, don't blame the meat. It's like if the meat went bad, if power went out in our house and our refrigerator quit working, and we came in, after being on vacation for a week and there was spoiled meat in our freezer, it'd be like saying, I can't believe those great steaks went bad on me. We'd be saying, oh man, the freezer didn't do its job. It didn't keep the meat frozen. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, if the meat's gone bad, if the world around you looks bad, it's because the salt has lost its saltiness. And the same thing he said, don't blame the darkness. You're supposed to be the light. And so again, the call of my book is for believers to think through what's it mean to be salt and light in a world that feels very contentious and hateful and seems just to be trying to win the argument.
Well, we're coming here close to the very end of our discussion, and it's been great talking with you. And I just have one quick question for you since I've got you captive here. We've known each other for about 12 years and worked together, different staffs and different things. Over that time, I'm curious, now that you look back, what surprises you the most about all that's happened?
My really quick first answer is I can't believe I got to do this. I literally would walk up those steps of the Capitol every day thinking, I can't believe I get to do this. Chrissy and I, first night we spent in the governor's residence, we were like, somebody's going to come get us and throw us out of here. They're going to find that we've snuck in here and they're going to come throw us out. So literally that sense of, who am I and who is my house that you have brought us thus far that David talks about. So I think that's one. The second one would be what I was talking about just a second ago. All of this matters more than we think in terms of electing the right people. And in the old days, I would have said, well, that means somebody that sees the world exactly like I do. And I still want somebody that thinks that addresses the economy the way I do and address, all different issues. But even more now, I want to have people in office who actually are intent on solving problems. And in a divided world like ours, solving problems means the ability to listen and understand the other side and to be committed to getting to the best answer and not just my answer. And that's that was the big truth I walked out of the office with.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Governor Haslam, for being with us. Thank you for sharing your book, Faithful Presence. I want to tell all our viewers, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to get a copy of this book, please use the Parnassus link to do that. It will allow us to continue to make this festival free. Also, if you want to donate to Humanities Tennessee, please feel free to go to their website. There's ways to do that there. Governor Haslam, thank you so much for your time. And thank you.
Really fun. Great to see you again, Nathan. Enjoy it.
Yes, sir.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.